Okay, today we're talking about the Cold War goes global, how the Cold War spread from its European origins to Asia in particular and to the rest of the world, which began roughly in 1949. Of course, 1949 is significant for many reasons. Stalin abandons the blockade of Berlin. Essentially, he admits defeat in his attempt to, as Khrushchev would famously say, cause pain in the West by squeezing on its testicles, namely Berlin. So Stalin tried to blockade Berlin from 48 to 49 for a period of 11 months. As you know, the Berlin airlift was successful, and it was a major propaganda victory for the United States and the United Kingdom, for the West, and it became apparent to most Germans that their fate would be better served to be with the West. This, of course, would be an issue throughout the Cold War. Those same planes that were dropping bombs on the Germans in 1945 that had burned Dresden to the ground in February of 1945 were used to bring in supplies, 9 tons a day, to Berlin to save the Berliners during the blockade by the Soviets. So it was a major victory for the United States, and one of the themes that we'll see throughout the Cold War is that, especially when Stalin was around, the United States seems to have a better understanding of what would later be called soft power, of the need to spread its influence through other means besides military power, through propaganda, through advertising, through building an image of freedom and democracy, etc., and through its corporations, through its lifestyle, through refrigerators, Hollywood, Coca-Cola, etc. The United States seems to have a better understanding of soft power than the Soviets do, at least in 1949. And Stalin was embarrassed by Berlin, but some other things happened in 1949 which excited Stalin, and in particular, in August of 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb under the leadership of Igor Kurkatov, also known as the Beard. There are some statues which remain to him to this day in Kazakhstan and other places. Very colorful character, and worked under a lot of pressure, and it was no longer the era of atomic diplomacy after August 1949, because the Soviets now had an atomic bomb. So that was a great relief to Stalin, who, as you know, was very fearful when the United States was the only atomic power in the world. So Stalin was embarrassed by Berlin, but he started looking towards Asia. And another event that, of course, would have encouraged Stalin in 1949 was the founding of the People's Republic of China. On the steps in Beijing, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic, and to great celebrations in Beijing and throughout most of China. The People's Republic of China and the People's Liberation Army were very popular. It was a tremendous victory for communism, or so it seemed, in 1949, but it was a terrible embarrassment to the Americans. And the rhetoric coming from the Americans was very much along the lines of, how did we lose China? And China was ours. How did we lose it? And some rather nasty investigations followed up, and this was the beginnings of the McCarthyism in the United States, of McCarthyism and the hunt for communist spies within the United States government. And this was very embarrassing for the U.S. that they had put so much money into the nationalist side of the Chinese Civil War, and that the nationalists had just crumbled. But the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, they were too much rooted in the urban middle classes. They ignored the needs of the rural masses of the people of China. They ignored the needs of the peasants. They were too corrupt. They had an enormous inflation problem, and they just could not sustain their vision of government, and they could not win the war. The Soviets helped the communists, in particular in Manchuria. There's no doubt that the Soviets had taken a lot of Japanese weaponry and a lot of Japanese prisoners as well, and this happened at the end of World War II, and the Soviets turned over a lot of the weapons to the Chinese communists. So the Chinese communists were getting help from the Soviet Union during the Chinese Civil War. So Stalin, who had been embarrassed in Berlin, again started looking more towards Asia, and the military victory that the communists had achieved in China. And Mao got onto a train. It was actually Chiang Kai-shek's personal train that the communists had seized, and he took it up to Moscow in December of 1949. It got very cold on the train. Chiang Kai-shek used to use that train to shuffle between Shanghai and Nanjing, or Nanking, and that's a warm weather part of China, and it wasn't really equipped to go so far north as Moscow. And of course they had to change the tracks when they went from China to, they didn't change the tracks, they had to change the gauge when they went from China to the Soviet Union, and that took some delay, and Mao was very cold, and he complained bitterly about how cold that train trip was. And he didn't have a very nice time up in Russia. He went for 2 months, and he felt like he had not been very well treated, and he felt right from the beginning that Stalin was sort of looking down on him, and that Stalin had this, what would later be called, big brother chauvinism. But Stalin felt like he was the leader of the communist world, and that Mao would have to pay respect to him. Already, by this time, Kim Il-sung has approached Stalin and said, I want to invade South Korea, we can knock them out. But the first time, before the Soviets had the bomb, Stalin said to Kim Il-sung, no, this will not be tolerated, I will not support you. But in 1950, the second time around, Stalin gives permission for Kim Il-sung to invade South Korea. And this is how the Cold War becomes hot. So let's look at some of the themes about the Cold War becoming hot when it moves into Asia that I want to explore with you over the next couple of weeks. And these are, the first one is coming from a Norwegian historian, a very important historian of the Cold War, who has written a book called The Global Cold War. His name is Arne Westad, and his claim, his thesis is that the Cold War was fought mainly in the South, that it was a global Cold War, and that it will be remembered as the pan-European world trying to maintain and extend its hegemony over the rest of the world. Now, what does he mean by that? What he's saying is the pan-European world, and in particular those two empires at the edges of the European world, the pan-European world, meaning the Soviets and the Americans, or the Americans and the Soviets, are trying to extend the imperial system that they had inherited from the European imperial powers, namely the British, the French, the Dutch, etc. So his argument is that the Americans and the Soviets saw the rest of the world, China, Vietnam, the Middle East, Afghanistan, etc., as needing European leadership or pan-European leadership. Essentially he means white people, and that they could only see these independent struggles that were happening in Asia in particular, the Middle East and Africa as well, through the views of their own struggle, which was communism versus democratic capitalism. And therefore they misunderstood the independent struggles, and a lot of catastrophic mistakes were made. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Southern Africa, etc. That's a very interesting thesis, in my opinion, that's kind of shifting the historiography of the Cold War. So we're no longer so interested in spies and missiles and what might have been, and we're now more interested in tanks and helicopter gunships and, you know, millions of people that were killed in the Third World and what really happened. So this, in my view, is sort of a contemporary interpretation of the Cold War, which is neither revisionist or orthodox. All right. So those are some of the themes that I want to pursue as we get into the events that brought the Cold War from Europe to Asia. And of course, the first event and very significant event that brought the Cold War from Europe to Asia was the Civil War in China. Now, as soon as you mention Civil War in China, you have a debate on your hands because when did it start? I think most historians will say now that it started in 1927 with the White Terror, where the nationalists executed many communists. And however, the area that we want to focus on right now in terms of the Cold War is 46 to 49, 46, 47, 48, 49. And as I said earlier, the nationalists are simply unable to sustain their spending, their military side, their military approach to the Chinese Civil War, because the communists have a much better strategy and a much better overall war effort. And by that I mean that they're fighting a guerrilla war, they're being secretly aided by the Soviets, and as Mao famously said, a revolutionary soldier amongst the people is like a fish in the sea. And so the Chinese communists just fought when they could, and they fought in small battles. They didn't fight these grand pitched battles between armies, which is what the nationalists were looking for. And the nationalists kept getting more big guns and big munitions from the United States, and eventually the communists would peck away at them until the nationalists ran. And in the end, the Chinese communists ended up using mostly American equipment that they had won on the battlefield to win the Chinese Civil War. So as I mentioned earlier, it was a big embarrassment in the United States because the United States had been pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into this war in terms of aid, military aid, and loans to Chiang Kai-shek and his government. The other thing that we have to remember is that the United States itself was unsure of its own policy. And, they'd kind of fallen in love with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Mei-ling, on her tour of the United States. And the senators were quite wooed by her. However, many of them had doubts about the nationalists, and the reports about the nationalist corruption were coming in. And there had been missions that had gone up and visited the communists and said that the communists were legitimately popular fighting force. So the U.S. itself was kind of mixed in terms of its support for the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. However, the Soviets they knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted the communists to win. But in public, the Soviets were quite clever about declaring that they were for peace, that they recognized the nationalists, etc. Okay, so by October 1st, 1949, the People's Republic of China is declared, and the world situation is such that China is now communist, and communism seems to be on the up and up. And the Americans are quite worried about this because it's starting to look like the dominoes are falling, and it's starting to look like the communist aggression is taking over parts of the world, and the United States is very worried that China has fallen. What's going to be next? And in particular, they're worried about Japan, and they seem to miss being prepared for the invasion of South Korea. And sure enough, that happens on June 25th, 1950, a very important date in the history of the Cold War, when, as I said earlier, Kim Il-sung, the dictator of North Korea, wins permission with his army to invade South Korea, which is under the corrupt and inefficient military dictatorship of Syngman Rhee. And the North Koreans are convinced they'll just move in, push out the undisciplined and disorganized South Korean army, and will have won the war by the end of the year. And they were able to convince Stalin this. And the initial drive in the Korean War certainly indicated that the predictions of Kim Il-sung were correct, because within a month or so, they pushed right through Seoul and all the way down to around to encircle this second city of South Korea, Busan, and it looked like they were going to drive the Americans and Koreans, especially the South Koreans, right off the peninsula. However, the U.S. and Truman had to decide what to do, and Truman went to the United Nations, and he got 15 nations to agree to join the fight under the banner of the United Nations against what he called naked and unprovoked communist aggression. And sure enough, reinforcements started coming in from Japan very soon. And then, of course, General MacArthur from the United States planned and executed a brilliant strategy of an amphibious landing in Incheon behind enemy lines, and by the end of the year, the Americans had pushed all the way up. The Americans, the Koreans, and the other 14 countries in the coalition had pushed all the way up to the border of China. And it looked like they were going to win the war, and MacArthur was very excited and was hoping to take out the Chinese as well. And then, of course, the Chinese came into the war with about 1 million troops and pushed the Americans all the way back down, the Americans and the coalition forces all the way back down below the 38th parallel, and the Korean War ended in a stalemate, and the line was drawn across the middle of Korea, almost where the line began, very close to the 38th parallel. So after 3 years of fighting, not much was accomplished, except that a lot of Koreans and others were killed. And this is the first example of what we would call a proxy war in the Cold War. And what that means is that the real antagonists were the Soviet Union and the United States. The Korean people got stuck in the middle, and millions of Korean people died, and in the end, not much was accomplished. And as you know, still today, North and South Korea are divided.